Welcome to Well Read. I'm your host, Justin Chapman. Our guest today is Mark Edlitz, a writer and director. Mark, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Mark is the author of a new book called James Bond After Fleming, the continuation novels. I've been all about the Bond continuation novels this past year or two, so this book really spoke to me. He's also the author of How to Be a Superhero, Movies Go Forth, The Many Lives of James Bond, The Lost Adventures of James Bond, and he wrote and directed the award-winning independent film The Eden Myth, directed and produced Jedi Junkies, a film about extreme Star Wars fans. And he's also worked as a writer and producer for ABC News, NBC, CNBC, Discovery ID, and National Geographic's Brain Games. So, Mark, you take a real like scholarly approach to your work, which I really enjoy. And the fact that there's such a thing as Bond scholars, shows the depth of this universe that has been created, much of it by Fleming himself, but many others as well, of course. And then also this really dedicated community that has been built around it. And I see Bond After Fleming sort of in the same vein as Raymond Benson's James Bond Bedside Companion from the 80s. Just out of curiosity, have you ever thought of any original Bond story ideas or worked in any kind of fan fiction or thought about parlaying the scholarly work into a Bond story or novel as Benson did?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's hard not to be a Bond fan and not think, oh, I have an idea of, what I would love to do with it, that type of thing.
Mhm.
But for now, I respect my little corner of the Bond bookshelf.
And the book has this awesome cover by Sean Longmore, illustrations by Pat Carbajal, and an intro by John Peel, who also wrote novelizations of several of the James Bond Jr. Episodes. And you seem to have found this rare gap in the Bond literature. Just about every aspect of the Bond phenomenon has been written about ad nauseum, but there's no book about the continuation books. So where did you get this idea, and why did you decide to write James Bond After Fleming?
Uh, the idea started slowly. So my first book on James Bond is called The Many Lives of James Bond. And that was interviews with the creators of the movies and video games. And uh, so I interviewed a lot of Bond screenwriters and a lot of Bond directors. And I also interviewed a lot of actors who have played James Bond in different media. So that was all I expected to do on James Bond. But when I had to hand that in to my publisher, they wanted 80 to 100,000 words, and I had another 100,000 left over.
Mhm.
And so I realized that I needed to cut out everything that was not specific to that concept, and that became my second book, uh, the Lost Adventures of James Bond. And what this book is, and maybe we'll talk about it later, is unmade, out of print, forgotten Bond stories. And I had sort of assumed that I had shot my bolt with Bond and then I would be done with Bond. And then I wrote another book called Movies Go Forth. Wait, I bring props today. Um, Movies Go Forth, and that's about fourth films in popular movie franchises. So like Superman 4, Batman 4, and that's interviews with writers and directors. I spoke to Joel Schumacher about his Batman movie, and so I was trying to understand what were they thinking when they made these movies. Um, and as I was coming up with ideas for my fifth book, I had this idea of covering every James Bond continuation novel, uh, which includes novelizations, it includes short stories, and it includes a couple of narrative newspaper articles, and we could talk about that down the line. And as I was doing it, I also discovered that I was also discovering new Bond stories that I wasn't aware of.
Mhm.
Uh, but it seemed like a overwhelming project to read 50 books and not make it my life's work.
Yeah.
And I resisted the idea. I kept on telling my son about how much I didn't want to do this. And I realized as I was protesting, I doth protest too much, that it was really just a fun idea. And so I started to read every single James Bond novel after Fleming. And that's what this book is. It's a guide to all these works.
Yeah, I recently read all the continuation novels as well, except for the young Bond books, which is
Oh, you
next.
got to. You
So
have to.
yeah, I definitely will. And I mean, I know what a commitment that is. I mean, it's and then if you're also reading the books about Fleming and things about the James Bond, it can be over 100 books easily,
Oh, it's
uh,
time.
but also then to write summaries and commentary and all of that is a lot. What how long did it take you to
Oh,
finish?
so you let me answer that. You mentioned the Benson book. So this book was inspired in part by Raymond Benson's Bedside Companion, where he did many things. It looked at the movies, it looked at Fleming's life, and it looked at the novels. And he took the reader of that book inside uh, each Fleming novel. And then there's also another book out of print called The Bond Files. And that was a look, they did the same with films and comics, and they try to do that. And I can't remember when that was published, but those were two uh, uh, inspirations for my book. And I can't remember, you asked me how long did it take? I feel like a couple of years.
Mhm.
Um, and during that was a discovery process of not just what Bond books were out there, but also discovering how I wanted to introduce the reader to these continuation novels. And so I I wound up obviously chronologically writing about them, but not chronologically reading them. And each chapter, just to sort of define what the book is, it has a summary of the plot because I found it was useful for me just keeping track of, there's so many of the titles sound the same, and it
Mhm.
helped me sort of keep it straight. And I was like, well, if I'm having a problem with this and I'm devoting a couple of years
Yeah.
to this, perhaps I'm not the only one. And then follows that, there's commentary or observations about each book where I try to get inside the mind of the writer and suggest what I think they were trying to do.
Mhm.
How does this book fall into place? What were they going for in this book? Is this a Bond revenge book? Is this a book where all the villains get together and try to kill Bond? You know, you know, uh, Fleming did that, Benson did that, Gardner did that. What kind of Bond book is it? And then I also looked at um, Bond's character. What were they adding to Bond's character? And I
Mhm.
forgot all the different categories, but there's like 7 or 8. And I go through these 7 or 8 categories in each of the books to figure out or to share, what is it? What does this book say about Bond's personality, about uh, uh, his personal history, his work history, his cases, his tastes, his point of view, his philosophy. How does it take us inside Bond? Because the thing that interests me most about all these books is the Bond character.
Mhm.
And what do you share about Bond and what do you hold back? You can't share too much, but if you put all these together, you wind up seeing that they in fact do give a lot of details about Bond's life, but they're cleverly parsed out through the entire book.
Right.
And one of my goals was sort of to bring that together and sort of present it to the audience. And then there's also silly things, where in each book I tell you how his eggs are ordered.
Mhm.
Really silly things like that.
Yeah. The
Because
bastard meter.
yeah, oh yeah, the bastard meter is how in what way is Bond described like as a bastard in each book. You know,
Mhm.
bloody bastard, you know, filthy bastard, or just a plain old bastard. But he's usually a bastard.
Yeah. And then in continuity nods too, which is cool.
Oh yeah, yeah, continuity nods.
Mhm. How
So
authors, yeah.
yeah, so there's continuity within the author. So it's continuity with the author's own books. It could be or it could be a reference to Fleming,
Mhm.
or it could be a reference to another Bond author.
Right.
Uh, uh, Gardner would reference Fleming and Amos. Benson would reference Gardner, Amos, and Fleming.
Mhm.
And some of that was just sort of, some of that did provide a narrative continuity where the audience can infer that these are all the same character at different points in his timeline.
Mhm.
But you could also just looking at it as a sort of a tip of a hat where the writer is acknowledging, yeah, I know you've read these other books, you've seen these other movies. Benson says, and we should take him at his word, that his Bond books are separate from Gardner's books, and
Mhm.
that he does, while he does make reference to, you know, a Gardner villain or a Gardner girlfriend, his character is meant to be separate.
Right. Yeah, there's all these there's so many of them and so many different phases and authors that not all the continuity lines up. Of course, some are completely different universes. You know, like the movies are about to enter a new universe, essentially. Um,
I think that
it,
makes for better storytelling. I think it's better to have, I know as fans, we often like things to line up and make sense. Uh, and you know, with the movies, there was a through line between Connery, Lazenby, Moore, Dalton, and Brosnan. You could easily say that they're the same character.
right.
They were meant to be, and Craig's Bond, in my opinion, is meant to be a separate character
Mhm.
who echoes certain elements of those. And so, one who is a casual Bond airport fan, you know, walking the airport, sees a Bond book, oh, I'll take that up. There's no reason for for them to think otherwise. They might assume that Deaver's Bond is the same as, you
Mhm.
know, Horowitz's Bond, and
Right.
why wouldn't they? Because they're not in the weeds in all this.
Mhm.
But I think it allows for more creativity where you're not asking Horowitz to read 49 books before he starts his.
Right.
It makes for better books where they're only responding to Fleming.
Mhm. In the afterword of Bond After Fleming, you wrote that a second and final volume is coming, which will compare different novelist tenures, assess the similarities and differences across the entire series, and include interviews with many of the continuation authors. So, can you tell us about that and where in the process are you?
Yeah, I'm all the interviews are conducted.
Hmm,
Uh, and I'm editing it. I'm in advanced editing stages and it's going well.
nice. Do you have an idea of when that's coming out, or are you
I,
still working through it?
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe the end of the year. Maybe. I hope. We'll see.
So tell us a bit about the history of the continuation novels, how they originally came about after Fleming.
Sure. I will warn you that when asked to remember dates off the top of my head, I'm terrible at it, so I will get dates wrong. But my memory is that so Fleming died. So Fleming, you know, Casino Royale comes out in 53. He dies around 1964. Uh, and after his death, they of course publish The Man with the Golden Gun posthumously.
Mhm.
It was written, but it needed to be cleaned up, as they say. And then there was also a collection of short stories. So the question is, what happens to James Bond, the literary character, after Fleming died? Do we Glidrose, the publishers and the Ian Fleming Family Trust Board. Do we continue it, or do we say that this character was clearly Ian Fleming's creation, his fantasies? Do we stop it here out of respect?
Mhm.
And there was a good case to be made that you should stop it there.
Mhm.
During this period, continuation novels were not a big thing. They weren't part of the culture. Now we sort of accept that everyone's gonna get a whack at, Sherlock Holmes, Superman, Batman, you know, and you let that artist have their run, and then Frank Miller does his, Dark Knight run, and that defines the character for that. But someone else is gonna have it, and we're gonna have Adam West Batman.
Mhm.
That was less clear then, and it was less specifically in terms of novels, and specifically in terms of literature. But there was good reason to continue with the continuation novels, just to help with help maintain Fleming's cultural legacy.
Mhm.
It helps to have a new continuation novel come out every few years, and that helps shine light on Fleming's original works. And then there was also another issue in that other people were starting to attempt to publish Bond novels without the permission of Glidrose.
Mhm.
So, as a way to keep those people at bay, it was appropriate to start publishing their own works. And then it becomes, well, what are we going to do? And the first two, everyone knows that the first adult James Bond novel is Colonel Sun by Kingsley Amis, but there was also, The Adventures of James Bond Jr. 003 and a half,
Mhm.
sometimes 003 and a half, The Adventures of James Bond
All
Jr.,
right.
which was a sort of a delightful kids book in sort of the Hardy Boys vein. And so, and then of course it was Kingsley Amis's Colonel Sun, which came out, and many people today think that's their favorite
Mhm.
continuation novel. It was written nearly contemporaneously with Ian Fleming.
Mhm.
As we go on, it becomes further and further away from Fleming's time. And then after that, it came out, and not much happened in the 70s. There was what was called the authorized biography of James Bond, or James Bond, the authorized biography by John Pearson. And Pearson wrote a biography of Ian Fleming, so he was well suited to tell this story of, it has the premise of James Bond is being interviewed by an author, John Pearson, and must tell his life story. And the conceit of the book is that James Bond was a real person, and Fleming's adventures, both real and imagined, were created to confuse the enemy. Sort of like Casino Royale, the 67 version. And then in the 70s, there were two novelization, no, 70s, yeah. Then we have Christopher Wood's novelizations of the screenplays that he wrote for The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, I guess 77, 79. And Christopher Wood's Spy Who Loved Me is as if he took the Spy Who Loved Me movie and put it through like an Ian Fleming blender or prism. And so he writes the whole thing using essentially the story of the movie, but as Ian Fleming might. And so it's really wonderful.
Yeah.
Not everyone loves novelizations, that they can be hit and miss.
Mhm.
There are some very good ones, and this is certainly one of them.
Yeah.
And then John Gardner was considered, along with a few other writers, to pick up the mantle and continue the literary adventures of James Bond. And he wound up writing a whole bunch of them.
Mhm.
He wrote more original James Bond novels than even Fleming did, and Gardner also wrote two novelizations. What was important to Gardner was to make sure that the trade craft, the spy craft, was up to date, representing what was going on in the 80s and the 90s. And then after he had his run, Raymond Benson took over, and Benson wrote 6 original novels, 3 novelizations, and 3 published short stories and 1 unpublished. And his directive from Glidrose or Ian Fleming Publications was to take Fleming's James Bond character and put him in a movie-like plot. So, which is one of the things that people, I think, should try to keep in mind, and one of the things I try to do with this book, James Bond After Fleming, is provide some sort of context for what the authors of each Bond era are trying to do, because they're all trying to do something different, and it's a little bit, I don't want to say unfair, because you know, to compare one person's tenure to another. I mean, it's fun to, and one should, and one can with a critical eye, but but it's also useful to say, well, what were they asked to do, and did they succeed on those terms, as opposed to say, well, I wish they did something else.
Right.
And I think that's important to, not just for Benson, but for everybody. Everybody's working under certain guidelines, and those guidelines should be at least understood. And then after Benson did his nice run, Ian Fleming Publications took a little pause in the adult James Bond novels and did 2 nearly simultaneous spin-off. One was the Charlie Higson Young Bond series, and then the other are the Moneypenny Diaries. A lot of Bond fans go, whoa, that sounds like a terrible idea. And on the surface, young James Bond does not sound great. How do you take a adult material and sanitize it for children? And the answer is Charlie Higson. That's the answer. So you'll see when you get to them that they're really good, and it's not where James Bond runs into mini Jaws or mini Blofeld. It's not Muppet Babies for James Bond. The Higson's books chart Bond's emotional progression, and it was a great idea, and that's what makes those books, his 5 books and 1 short story, so great. And then you've got a trilogy, the Moneypenny trilogy, which are just as good as any continuation novel out there. They're just spectacular. You're a fan of those?
Oh yeah, I love them. Yeah.
Well, so, and I know a lot of Bond fans, when those came out, were like, "Oh, it's chick lit," was the quoted criticism, but it's not. These are proper spy novels.
Oh yeah.
And very worth checking out.
Yeah, and going back to the early history, I also remember that Anne Fleming was originally against the continuing the novels. Eventually, reluctantly came around. It's kind of hard not to when the movies became so popular at that point. People should check out Nicholas Shakespeare's excellent and very comprehensive new biography about Ian Fleming called The Complete Man. There's this anecdote in it where after Fleming had died, Anne Fleming discovers or a friend of their son, after he had also died, found an unpublished Fleming Bond manuscript and showed it to Anne, and Anne took it and threw it on the fire. Whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's just devastating.
Right. I have not completed the book. I know it was made with the support of the family, and it's a very well researched book, well reviewed as well. I think that there are some Bond experts who believe that, based on what we know about Ian Fleming's writing habits, that it's unlikely that there would be a secret James Bond book that was made in its entirety complete and then just toss aside. It
Right.
doesn't what we know about how he wrote and where he
Mm,
was in his career.
yeah,
Um, and I think that I think he put that at the end of the book,
he did.
Shakespeare.
Hmm.
And I think that's his way of saying this is a story that I was told,
Right.
and the person believed it, and I feel obligated to write it,
Hmm.
and report on what they said. But maybe his placement of it suggests that take of it what you will.
Yeah, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but yeah, and Fleming's health at that time, and a whole bunch of reasons why, maybe it's not true, but if it's true, man, that's just
It's a horrible thought in a way.
horrible. Yeah. And on the Money Penny Diaries, people can use this book Bond After Fleming in different ways. Like new readers to the Bond series can find one that might interest them. Seasoned readers can get a refresh. I had recently read all the Fleming and the continuation books, as I mentioned, except for Money Penny Diaries and Young Bond books. And then I heard you talking about many Money Penny Diaries,
I
and
see.
I was like, and saying to give them a chance, and I'm so glad I did, because
Oh, I'm
they're
so
among
pleased.
my favorites now. I mean,
Oh, great.
they're
I'm so
just
pleased.
they're just so well written, and how she weaves it into the history of the time. It's so good. And
Well, I'm so glad to hear that, because that's what I mean. That was the hope of the book, is that it would sort of pull one, just useful to have a guide with everything all together, but
Mhm.
also to have, someone you're in dialogue with, even though we're not together, where you're like, oh, well, this is, these are some thoughts about this book, and maybe that doesn't sound so bad, and I'll give that a chance. Like, that's
Mhm.
my hope, is that, we're all in sort of one big Bond reading club, even though we're not always communicating together.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, Bond aficionados haven't read every
No,
piece
no.
of the entire canon. And how, Eon doesn't make movies based on these Money Penny Diaries. I don't know. Um but in terms of the use of the book Bond After Fleming, I hadn't read the Young Bond book, so I haven't read that section yet because I didn't want spoilers, but people could use it,
Good,
in
yeah.
ways that they
No,
want. But um I really do, appreciate a resource like your book where you can refer back to them and quickly, remind myself. There's so many, it's hard to keep track. Some of them tend to blend
I,
together.
yeah, when
Um,
someone asks me a question, I now have to pull, because it's so many books, so many villains, so many
mhm.
stories, that
Yeah,
I find myself going to the book and peeking in it to go, oh, okay, that's that story.
yeah, absolutely. That said, do you think there's value? Do you think people should read all of the continuation novels and not see your book as sort of like a Cliff's Notes or a shortcut, so to speak, but there's real value in reading all of them at least
Right.
once?
As a joke, I thought I was gonna write. As an intro, I've read all these books so that you don't have to. Um, but I was like, I don't want to write that,
Hmm.
because that's not the goal. The goal is to get the conversation going, or what I would do with these kinds of books, when like I would watch The Twilight Zone or Alfred Hitchcock Presents, or whatever, or Star Trek, and I would watch the episode, and then I would go to the book for further insight, or really with the Hitchcock Truffaut. That's I would watch a Hitchcock film and then go to Hitchcock Truffaut and see what Hitchcock said about it, and I would go deeper. I with a film, with books, or
Hmm.
or guides. I mean, it's a terrible. I don't really like to say guide, but I think it's sort of a helpful
Right.
book to help people understand. So I'd say look look at the books and then come to this, or
Hmm.
you could just like peek and see, oh, that's what this book's about. I think that's good. I'll give that a shot.
Right. And then talk about how you chose what to include and exclude. Like, for example, you include the first James Bond Jr. book, 003 and a half, and some of the novelizations of Bond movies, but not the novelizations of some of the James Bond Jr. episodes, or like the Find Your Fate interactive book. So tell us
Right.
about that.
Um, So I wanted to include every s- every James Bond story that sort of initiated through Ian Fleming publication slash Glidrose.
Mhm.
Um, that where it was an extension of the Ian Fleming books. The I wrote about the Find Your Fate and what was the other one? The
The
James Bond Jr. novelization.
novelizations, yeah.
I'd already written about each of those
Mhm.
sort of in depth in the Lost Adventures of James Bond. So
Right.
I also just felt like, oh, I had covered that. There's no reason to
Mhm.
go back to that. But those just somehow felt different. Um, I don't know if I have a good answer to that, but it's probably those two things. I felt like it was somehow
Right.
those are somehow different, and that I had written enough about them, and there was nothing more to
Mhm.
say. In the Lost Adventures of James Bond,
Mhm.
I interviewed a bunch of the writers of those novelizations and of those Find Your Fate books, those that were alive.
Yeah, the
Sorry,
Lost
that's
Adventures is great too. It's it's like e- especially for Bond of aficionados who have read all the Fleming books, seen all the movies, read all the continuation books, read all the books about the movies and the books. Um, it's like there's all these new Bond adventures that you can experience for the first time. So tell us about some of those lost adventures. There's the whole James Bond Jr. Cartoon, ton of comic books, comic strips, um,
yeah.
and Dalton movie, Lost Dalton movies.
Yeah, let me see if I can remember. Um, yeah, The Lost Adventures of James Bond. And it's about the lost, out of print and forgotten James Bond stories. And those, as you say, are broken up. I guess clearly the biggest hook of the book is the unmade Dalton.
Mhm.
And for the unmade Dalton, I go into his unmade third film, two different iterations of that had a similar story, but were conceived in such different ways. The first one is what I call is more of like a stylish techno thriller, and the second iteration of his third film would have been more of an action comedy, where he's like, I'm too old for this stuff, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And then the fourth one was more of it was called Reunion with Death, and it felt very Fleming. And then I also go into an alternate first one, where it would have been James Bond Begins, essentially,
Mhm.
where it just told his recruitment into the Double O service, um, as well as his first adventure. Uh, so that is by far the biggest hook. Uh, I also, as you say, wrote about James Bond Jr. James Bond Jr. is not available on DVD, but they put a lot of Eon put a lot of effort and care into it, and their ambitions for the show were much greater than sort of the realized product of 65 episodes that play Monday through Friday in a block.
Mhm.
They were really, their goal was to tell a James Bond style cartoon in 30 minutes, but it's really not 30 minutes. It's probably closer to 21 or 22.
Mhm.
Um, and the budget that probably didn't support those dreams. They were going for something not something more akin to Batman the Animated Series, where it played for adults and kids,
Mhm.
where it was just sophisticated storytelling, and they had the hope to use the James Bond theme, and James Bond was going to appear not on camera, but you would hear his voice from time to time. So I get into their initial plans for it fairly in depth. And this book probably has more is probably has more words about and pages about James Bond Jr. than any other book, for good or for bad. I went, I went, I went full hog or whatever it's called into James Bond Jr. Whole hog.
I know it gets a bad rap from the the general Bond community. I think you wrote that that the Bond community doesn't agree on much, but they agree that that wasn't its best, the best iteration of Bond. Um, but you writing about them inspired me to go back and watch all 65, which I'm
Oh my
currently.
God.
They're all available on YouTube in poor, terrible quality. But if you squint your eyes a little and suspend your disbelief and remember what it was like to be a kid, they're not half bad. There's a Bond adventure in each one. Some are better than others, obviously. And then the novelizations by John Peel are fun.
Yeah, you got John Peel writing
Yeah.
James Bond. I mean, what could be better than that?
Yeah,
John Peel,
exactly.
for many fans, is they know him as the Doctor Who guy.
Mhm.
Um, Steve Cole, who wrote Young Bond, the second series of Young Bond adventures, he's also written a bunch of Doctor Who. But it was super. I I interviewed John Peel for the Lost Adventures of James Bond, and I asked him a ton of questions about his 6 novelizations. And I have and I met him. We were at a con. We were both there with our books, and I brought all my books, and he signed them for me, which was they're in terrible condition.
Mhm.
These are the worst condition books. They're all beat up and falling apart, but those are the books I had him sign. He was so nice to do that. And then he wrote the forward to James Bond After Fleming, which was
Mm.
super
Yeah.
generous of him.
Yeah, that was awesome. Well, Mark, I really appreciate you coming on and doing this and talking about. It's so nice to talk to someone who knows so much about the continuation novels. Like the Bond community is pretty big, but fewer people know about Fleming and his books, and even fewer people know about the continuation novels. And
Yeah,
so everyone, yeah,
I really appreciate it. I mean, and this art is so beautiful that
yeah,
Sean did. And
yeah,
then if I could I'll try to quickly hold up something that Pat did,
yeah,
because the trick about writing about as we wrap up these about a novel is that you don't have art to show your readers. And so what do you do? And so Pat, would draw these, there's aerial assaults that Pat has drawn, cars, Bond being tortured, his weapons. Here's one. From Icebreaker, where Bond is stripped and dunked in the ice like a tea bag and
mm,
put up and down and put up and down. And it's like, and Pat illustrated that. So part of the joy, I hope, with these books, is seeing the wonderful art. I know
yeah.
that's my favorite parts.
Yeah, the art is excellent, and just the way you tie it all together, you know how you were saying about how you're examining how each author approached the book rather than comparing one against the other. And really looking forward to the second volume as well. I'd love to
Thank
hear
you.
from the continuation authors themselves. So,
Yeah.
well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Mark.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Okay, before we go, let's check in with our senior influencer correspondent, Bradford.
Hi everybody, it's Brad. It happened just like with my hand over my face. The moon did cover the sun, and we call that an eclipse. No one really was sure if it was gonna happen. Not even the scientists. They don't really know how it works or anything like that. But what it does mean that it did actually happen, and it only mattered because, I mean, they say eclipses happen like 2 to 5 times a year, but this is the only one that mattered because it went over the United States, the most important country in the whole world. And, scientists don't really understand how it happens. They weren't sure if it was going to even happen or not. But because it did happen, and here's the thing, what we know is that now we've entered post-apocalyptic times. It's a little bit scary. It's a little bit scary, but you know what? I'm going to urge you to just keep being yourself, be you, live, laugh, love, all that stuff. Just be you. It's not that bad. So anyway, I hope that influenced you. Enjoy the post-apocalyptic world. Bye. Take care. Love you.
Thank you for that report, Bradford. And thank you for watching this episode of Well Read. Learn more about my work at justindouglaschapman.com and sign up to receive my free email newsletter to get updates on what I'm working on at justinchapman.substack.com. And remember, a life well read is a life well spent. So go read a book. Till next time.